No one wanted to take that night shift. It had been posted on the job assignment board for more than 2 weeks. Many people had seen it. Not a single person accepted it. Not because the pay was low. On the contrary, this shift paid more than usual. But because it was too long, too lonely, and too mentally draining. Alone, all night, inside a massive, empty building where every sound echoed more clearly than usual. Michael Turner was the only one who paused in front of that notice for more than a few seconds. He stood there in the cramped labor brokerage office, fluorescent lights casting a pale glow over a black and white sheet of paper with just a few lines printed on it. Night security shift, Whitmore Plaza, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A job no one wanted, yet a job he could not refuse. That morning before leaving home, his daughter, Emma, had asked a hushed question, almost casually as he bent down to tie her shoelaces. "Dad, why do you always take the hardest jobs?" Michael froze for a brief moment. He didn't answer right away. Not because he lacked an answer, but because he didn't know how to put it into words that an 8-year-old child could understand. How do you explain that some people are never given the choice of an easy path? How do you say that sometimes the only thing left to cling to is responsibility? Whitmore Plaza rose in the night like a colossal block of glass, towering in the heart of downtown Columbus. 55 floors of steel and glass reflected the streetlights, beautiful in a cold, distant way. By day, the place was full of people, office workers, managers, engineers, security guards, janitors. But at night, it resembled a sleeping creature, with only the quiet hum of machinery operating in the darkness. Michael swiped his access card at 11:12 p.m. The security desk was empty. A cup of coffee had gone cold long ago. The shift logbook lay open, the handwritten entries thinning with each page, as if the people before him had slowly given up. He flipped through a few pages, nothing unusual noted. No warnings, no messages left behind, just an ordinary night shift. At least, that's how it looked on paper. He clipped his radio on, checked the batteries in his flashlight, and began his first patrol. The building's main lobby was so vast that his footsteps echoed back to his own ears. Polished marble floors, towering glass walls, everything designed to impress those who passed through for only a few minutes before leaving. But at this hour, it all felt empty, almost fragile. Michael had worked many jobs in his life. Before his wife died, he had been a construction supervisor, a stable job, a life that seemed to be on track. Then illness came. Medical bills, sleepless nights in the hospital, and finally a phone call he would never forget. After that, everything collapsed, slowly, but irreversibly. Now he took whatever work he could, any shift as long as it paid enough to keep the small apartment for him and his daughter, to cover electricity and water bills, and, most importantly, to ensure that Emma could continue going to school and continue believing that her future was still ahead of her. As Michael walked through the long, desolate corridors, the air conditioning system murmured within the walls. Elevators occasionally chimed softly as if the building itself were dreaming, just him, one solitary heartbeat in a space built for thousands. There are places created for human presence, and there are places where, once people leave, only a silence remains, so deep that it forces you to face yourself. Michael did not know that this shift would change his life. He did not know that, in just a few hours, a quiet decision would be made, one that would force an entire system of power to look at itself again. At this moment, he was simply a father doing a job no one else wanted, just an ordinary man stepping into a building filled with things he had never been paid to see. But sometimes, the people no one expects are the ones who do not turn away. After completing his first patrol, Michael began to clearly sense what those before him had never said out loud. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't strange noises. It was the kind of prolonged silence that slowly causes a person to lose their sense of direction. The building was far larger than he had imagined when standing outside. Corridors connected endlessly to corridors. Identical doors lined the walls, and technical areas were tucked away behind cold, gray metal signs. Everything had been built to function smoothly during the day, when there were people, when there was light, when voices filled the air, phones rang, and hurried footsteps echoed through the halls. But at night, all of that disappeared. Michael was the only one moving. Each step he took echoed clearly against the stone floor. The sound returned to his ears like a reminder. He was alone. No one to talk to. No one to confirm that what he heard or saw was real. Only the steady operation of machinery, ventilation fans, pumps, electrical panels, things that never sleep, but also never respond. He passed through office floors where empty desks still held unfinished paperwork. A forgotten coffee cup sat on a table. A jacket was draped over the back of a chair. Small traces showed the place had been alive during the day, but at night, they felt like evidence of a life that had withdrawn, leaving behind a strangely cold space. There were moments when Michael had to stop, standing still for a few seconds to make sure the sound he had heard wasn't his imagination. In extended silence, every noise became more significant than usual. A faint clink of metal touching metal, a soft hiss from an air duct, a tiny click from an electrical panel. Nothing was wrong, but nothing made him feel at ease. Michael had once thought that working alone at night was simply dull. In reality, it was much more than that. It forced a person to face their own thoughts. There was no noise to distract him, no one to divert his attention. And thoughts, when uninterrupted, often traveled to the deepest places. He thought about Emma. At this hour, she was probably asleep on the sofa at the neighbor's apartment, hugging the old stuffed rabbit she always claimed she was too grown up to need anymore, yet never let out of her hands. He could picture her sleeping face clearly, brows slightly furrowed, as if she were still thinking about a math problem she hadn't finished. That thought made the surrounding space feel a little less cold. Michael continued upward to higher floors where few people ever went. The technical areas weren't designed to look good. They only needed to work. Bare concrete walls, harsh white fluorescent lights, control panels covered in symbols and numbers that most people passing by would never read. He had no real reason to inspect these areas closely. His assignment, on paper, was to patrol, check doors, and ensure there was no unauthorized entry. But something about this space made him slow down. Not curiosity, something more challenging to define. As if no one in a very long time had truly looked at this building. In some corners, dust had accumulated more heavily than usual. A few technical doors opened with a faint creak, suggesting they hadn't been used often. Tiny details, tiny ones, but to Michael, they were no longer things he could ignore. He had once been a construction supervisor. He knew what it felt like when a system was neglected, kept running only because it worked yesterday. He understood the difference between a place that was cared for and one that existed purely on inertia. In certain parts, this building felt like the latter. When the clock on his radio ticked over to 1:48 a.m., Michael stopped by a window on an upper floor. The city below was still lit, but sparsely. Streets stretched like glowing threads through the darkness. Somewhere down there, small homes were wrapped in sleep. Families rested, believing that tomorrow everything would function the same as it had today. He wondered how many of them worked in this building. How many trusted that when they stepped into a high-rise like this, someone had made sure everything was safe. Michael stood there a moment longer, one hand resting on the cold railing. He didn't know why these thoughts came to him. It could be the fatigue of the night shift. Perhaps the silence had allowed his mind to wander farther than necessary. He turned and continued his patrol. At this point, he still didn't know that in just a few minutes, a small detail, a number, slightly off on a gauge, would completely change the way he saw this building. and change his life as well.
Michael stopped in front of the gray metal door at the end of the corridor on the 52nd floor. On the small placard mounted beside it, the words, "Mechanical Room, Authorized Personnel Only," had faded with time. There was nothing remarkable about this door. It looked precisely like dozens of other technical doors he had passed over the past hour. If he had been moving quickly, if he had been doing only what was strictly required, he could have walked right past it without noticing. But Michael didn't move on. Not because of a sound, not because of an alert, but because of a faint sensation, like rereading a familiar sentence and suddenly realizing one word is out of place. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was smaller than he expected. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over pipes running along the ceiling, control panels lining the walls, and a row of neatly arranged round metal pressure gauges. The pump hummed steadily, evenly. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Michael walked closer to the gauges. He had no obligation to read them. No one had asked him to. Nothing in the job description said the night shift was required to check the fire suppression system. But some habits are hard to break. Years working in construction had taught him this. When a system is truly stable, it doesn't need to look fine. It has to be right. He bent down and looked more closely. The needle on the main pressure gauge was resting at a position that made him frown. Not an apparent malfunction, not deep in the red danger zone, just slightly below normal. Slightly enough that an untrained eye could easily ignore it. Michael stood still for a few seconds. He glanced at the secondary gauge, then back at the main one, then at the technical specifications chart posted on the wall. This time the sensation in his chest was unmistakable. The pressure was nearly 40% below standard. 40%. In a fire suppression system, that isn't a margin of error. It's the difference between control and helplessness. Michael swallowed. He told himself it might be temporary. The system may be in standby mode. Maybe there was some technical reason he didn't understand. But instead of turning away, he reached out and touched the maintenance log attached beside the control panel. The logbook was thick, the paper yellowed along the edges. He flipped through the pages. This week, last month, 3 months ago. They all looked the same. The same line, normal operating range. The same handwriting. The same repeated initials. Michael felt a chill run down his spine, not because he had found a technical fault, but because of the unnerving perfection of those confirmations. He had seen this before. On projects where costs were cut, in places where reports mattered more than reality, when people stopped checking and signed. Michael took a step back and looked around the room. These pipes carried water throughout the upper floors. Those sprinkler heads were designed to activate when temperatures spiked. Everything depended on pressure. If a fire broke out, the system would activate. The alarms would sound, the lights would flash, but the water would come too weak, too late. And then no procedure could undo that mistake. Michael thought about the people who worked in the building during the day, office workers carrying coffee to upper floors, cleaning staff coming in after hours. Meetings are held directly beneath these ceilings. They knew nothing. They entered the building every day with a fundamental belief that someone had made sure everything was safe. Michael looked back at the gauge one more time. He could walk away. He could write "no abnormalities" in the shift log. He could finish his shift and no one would ever know he had stood here. No one, except him. In that moment, he remembered Emma's question from that morning, not in words, but as a feeling that was clear and impossible to ignore. There are moments in life that don't ask whether you want to be involved. They only ask whether you dare to look straight at them. Michael pulled out his phone and took a photo, then another. Then he recorded a short video just to be sure he wasn't mistaken.
He didn't know what he would do with them, not yet, but he knew one thing. If he didn't preserve the evidence, then this had never existed. When he left the mechanical room, the metal door closed behind him with a soft click, but in Michael's mind, another door had just opened. From that moment on, the night shift was no longer just a job. It had become a choice, and he knew that, whether he wanted to or not, he would have to see it through to the very end. Michael stood in the hallway for a few seconds after the mechanical room door closed softly behind him. There were no alarms, no red warning lights, no signs at all suggesting that what he had just seen was an immediate emergency. That calmness was precisely what unsettled him. The building continued to operate as if everything were okay. Elevators moved up and down according to their preset schedules. The air conditioning system kept pushing out steady streams of cool air. Electrical panels remained lit, numbers blinking in orderly patterns. From the outside, Whitmore Plaza was a flawless machine. But Michael knew some machines break in tranquil ways. He raised his radio. "Night security calling building management." Only static answered. Michael tried again, slower, clearer. No response. He checked the emergency contact list taped inside the security binder. The sheet of paper was old, the top corner slightly curled as if no one had opened it in a long time. He dialed the first number. The phone rang, once, twice, then went to voicemail. The second number, the same. On the third number, a woman answered, her voice sleepy and openly irritated. "What is it?" Michael took a deep breath. He gave his name and shift and briefly but clearly explained the pressure issue in the fire suppression system. On the other end, there was silence for a few seconds. Then her tone changed. No longer sleepy, no longer uncertain. Just the calm certainty of someone who already believed she was right. "That system is inspected regularly. If there were a problem, engineering would have reported it." "I'm standing in front of the pressure gauge right now," Michael said, keeping his voice steady. "It's significantly below standard." "You're new, aren't you?" the woman replied, her voice sharpening. "Listen, the night shift is simple. Do your rounds, sign the log, go home in the morning. Don't create unnecessary problems." The call ended before Michael could say anything else. He stood still, the radio still in his hand. The hallway was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat, steady in his chest, not fast, not frantic, but heavy. No one said he was wrong, but no one wanted to hear that he might be right. Michael continued his patrol, but his steps had changed. Every door he passed, every ceiling he looked up at now carried a different weight. Not curiosity, but responsibility that had settled on his shoulders, even though no one had officially placed it there. He thought about the signatures in the maintenance log, about someone who had seen those numbers, or hadn't, and signed anyway. He thought about managers who trusted reports and people higher up who trusted the system itself. A long chain of trust, with no one truly checking the final link. That was how major disasters often began, not with malice, but with convenience. Michael was familiar with advice like that. Don't make a big deal out of it. Don't draw attention. Just do your job. Over the past 3 years, he had heard those words in almost every temporary job. In warehouses, on construction sites, during long-haul driving shifts. That was how people survived when they had no real choices, when every paycheck mattered, when a single misstep could cost them everything. He understood that better than anyone. But tonight, that advice sounded different, because behind those numbers weren't lifeless machines. They were people. Michael stopped by a window on a high floor and looked down at the sleeping city. Small houses, empty roads, darkened windows. Somewhere down there, Emma was sleeping peacefully, believing that tomorrow her father would come home as he always did. He wondered if, should something happen, he could look at her and say, I knew, but I chose to stay silent. The answer came immediately. No. Michael knew he was standing in line. On one side was familiar safety, finishing his shift, collecting his pay, continuing a fragile but stable life. On the other hand was an uncertain path where every action could lead to consequences he wasn't prepared to bear. No one would blame him if he turned away. No one, except himself. He glanced at his watch, nearly 3 a.m. There were still many hours left before morning, and in that time Michael understood one thing clearly. Once the truth has been seen, it can never be unseen. The question was no longer whether he should do something. It was what he would do and how far he would go. And in that very moment, in the silence of the building, Michael Turner began making a decision that would change not just this night shift, but his entire life. Michael stepped into the stairwell to escape the echo of the long hallway. The steel door closed behind him, leaving a narrow space where dim yellow lights fell over concrete steps worn smooth by years of use. It was quieter here. No machinery noise, no sense of being watched by glass walls. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. The screen lit up. 3:02 a.m. Michael didn't know what he was looking for. A text message, a missed call, some reason to pause the surge of thoughts spiraling through his mind, but all he saw was a simple notification, a new voicemail sent less than 10 minutes earlier. Sender, Mrs. Carter, the neighbor who watched Emma whenever he worked night shifts. Michael tapped the play icon, lowering the volume out of habit, as if afraid of disturbing the sleeping building. Then he heard his daughter's voice. "Hi, Dad." Emma's voice was small and slightly hoarse, as if she had tried to stay awake but couldn't. "I was going to wait for your good night text, but I'm really sleepy." Michael closed his eyes for a moment. "I hope your new job is going okay. I know you work really hard for the two of us." There was a brief pause, then her voice softened, gentler. "I love you, Dad. Good night. See you in the morning." The message ended with a faint, barely audible breath. Michael didn't move. He stood still in the stairwell, gripping the phone tightly. In that moment, everything around him seemed to disappear. The building, the shift, the numbers on the pressure gauge, the calls that had been cut short. There was only the father's and his daughter's voice. He played the message again. Then a third time. Each time, Emma's voice seemed more straightforward, closer, as if she were standing right in front of him, looking up with eyes full of trust. A simple, unconditional trust. Completely unaware that at this very moment her father was facing a choice for which no guidebook existed. Michael leaned against the stairwell wall, feeling the cold of the concrete seep through his jacket. He remembered that morning, how Emma had asked what seemed like an offhand question as he tied her shoelaces. He remembered the look in her eyes then. Not curiosity, but observation. Children often see more than adults believe. Michael had once thought that being a father meant shielding his child from everything bad, but the longer he lived, the more he understood. What mattered even more was giving his child something to look up to. If one day Emma asked him, "Dad, you knew something wasn't safe, so what did you do?" How would he answer? That he stayed silent because he was afraid of losing his job? That he turned away because he thought it wasn't his responsibility? That he trusted the system, even though he had seen with his own eyes that it was cracking? Michael knew that answer would follow him for the rest of his life. Not in his employment records, not in anyone else's memory, but in a very private, tranquil moment each morning when he looked at himself in the mirror. He reopened the photo he had taken in the mechanical room. The gauge needle was still there, unchanged, unconcerned with whether he hesitated or not. The truth does not disappear just because people don't want to face it. Michael took a deep breath. There are moments when life doesn't ask who you want to become. It asks what you are willing to lose to avoid losing yourself. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, but Emma's voice remained, echoing softly in his mind, not as a push, but as a reminder. No one was watching. There was no audience, no reward, just a decision and its consequences. Michael left the stairwell and returned to the long hallway. His steps no longer hesitated, not fast, but steady, as if he had accepted that from this moment on, the night shift was no longer the most important thing. What mattered more was the person he would become after the sun rose. And as Michael Turner walked toward the central security room, he already had his answer. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew that, at the very least, he would not have to lower his head in front of his daughter. Michael sat down in the swivel chair inside the central security room. The room was small, lit with stark white light, with a row of surveillance monitors lined up in front of him. Camera feeds appeared clearly on the screens. Empty hallways, silent elevators, closed doors. Everything was still calm, still orderly, still exactly the way the system wanted people to believe it was. He set his flashlight on the desk, removed his gloves, and turned on the computer. The screen displayed a familiar interface, simple, outdated, giving no hint that this was a place meant for significant decisions. Michael entered the login credentials written on a piece of paper taped beside the monitor. He paused for half a second, not out of hesitation, but because he understood clearly. Once he pressed enter, there would be no turning back. The screen loaded slowly, then displayed a list of systems: security, electrical, HVAC, and fire suppression. Michael clicked on the last one. Technical diagrams appeared. Numbers ran alongside each floor. He scrolled down, line by line, slowly. And then, what he had feared became undeniable. The problem wasn't limited to a single mechanical room. Low pressure extended across the entire upper section of the building, from the 50th floor upward, more than 20 floors. Michael leaned back in his chair and let out a heavy breath. In his mind, images surfaced uninvited. Glass-walled conference rooms, offices with sweeping views, places where major decisions were made every day. Places where people believed they were working in the safest environment possible. None of them knew that if something happened, the system entrusted with protecting them would not be strong enough to do its job. Michael opened his phone, connected it to the computer, and began uploading the images he had taken. Each photo, each video clip he labeled clearly. No emotion, no speculation, just facts, carefully recorded. He reopened the digital maintenance logs, cross-checking timestamps, signatures, and actual data. The numbers didn't match. The completed inspections repeated themselves with suspicious consistency. A picture slowly formed, not of a single mistake, but of prolonged neglect. Michael wasn't angry, nor did he feel heroic. The only feeling inside him now was absolute focus, as if everything before this moment had merely been preparation. At 4:29 a.m., Michael moved the mouse toward an icon he had seen since the beginning of his shift, but never imagined he would use. Level 2 Safety Incident Report. He read the description one more time, even though he already knew it by heart. Activate an official incident report. No evacuation, no system activation. Create a mandatory record to be forwarded to relevant departments and authorities at the start of business hours. One click. No loud sound, no flashing lights. Nothing changed in the building. Only a small line of text appeared on the screen. Incident logged. Michael began writing the report. He added no emotion. He didn't ramble. He didn't use strong language. He recorded what he had seen, what he had measured, and what the system was showing. Each timestamp, each floor, each parameter. At the end of the report, the system asked for the name of the responsible party. Michael paused. There were many ways to avoid it. He could use the shared account. He could leave it blank. He could pretend he didn't know. But then he thought of Emma's voice, of her question that morning, of the trusting look she always gave him. Michael typed, Michael Turner. He clicked submit. In that moment, something tiny but very important happened. Not in the system, but within him. Michael was no longer just someone working the night shift. He was someone who had chosen to stand on the side of the truth, even when no one had asked him to. He sent the report to all the emergency contacts listed, checked it once more, then shut down the computer. The room became quieter than ever. Michael leaned back in the chair, pulled out his phone, and opened Emma's voicemail again. He didn't need to listen to it. Just seeing her name on the screen was enough. Outside, the sky was beginning to change color. An ashen gray lined the horizon, signaling that morning was approaching. Michael stood up, adjusted his jacket, and took one last look at the surveillance monitors. The building was still there. Solid, silent, unaware that in just a few hours, the truth would force it to confront itself. Michael Turner walked out of the security room carrying a strange feeling, not relief and not fear, but the calm of someone who had done what he could not avoid doing. And somewhere, in a small apartment, an 8-year-old girl was still sleeping peacefully, unaware that her father had just left her a legacy that money could never buy. The shift ended at 7 in the morning. Michael signed his name in the handover log, his handwriting steady, not a tremor in sight. The day shift guard walked in and nodded at him just like every other morning. No questions, no curiosity. No one knew that only a few hours earlier, in this very building, a report had been triggered, quietly, officially, and irrevocably. Michael put on his jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was cool. The city was waking up. The first cars rolled onto the streets. A coffee shop on the corner opened its doors, the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting lightly on the breeze. Everything looked so familiar that it almost felt absurd. The world hadn't changed. Only he had. Michael stood at the bus stop for a few minutes, hands in his pockets, eyes following the horizon as it slowly brightened. There were no heroic visions in his mind, no thoughts of rewards or consequences, only one obvious truth. What he had done the night before no longer belonged to him. It had been sent. It had a name, and it would find its own path. The bus arrived. Michael stepped on and took a seat by the window. The city slipped past behind him, rows of buildings, familiar street corners flowing by like frames from an old film reel. He felt tired, not the kind of fatigue in the muscles, but the exhaustion that comes from crossing a line no one else can see. When the bus stopped at his usual stop, Michael got off and walked toward his building. A small, old 3-story structure, bricks faded with age, iron railings chipped and peeling. No security guard, no grand lobby, just a place to come home to. Mrs. Carter was in the kitchen when he opened the door. The smell of toast and fried eggs filled the small space. "Good morning," she said with a smile. "Emma just woke up." Michael nodded his thanks, his voice hoarse after a sleepless night, and stepped into the living room. Emma was sitting at the dining table, still in her pajamas, a bowl of cereal in front of her, and a school library book beside it. She looked up when she heard the door, her eyes lighting up instantly. "Dad!" Before Michael could say a word, Emma ran over and hugged him tightly. Her arms were small but warm, unmistakably authentic. He bent down and hugged her back, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling her steady breathing against him. "Are you tired, Dad?" Emma asked, looking up at him. "A little," Michael smiled, "but I'm okay."
Was your work big? Very big, he replied. The biggest place I've ever worked. Emma thought for a few seconds, then asked, as if it were the most critical question in the world, "Did you see any ghosts?" Michael laughed, a soft laugh, but much lighter than before. "No," he said. "Just a lot of empty hallways and some machines that needed checking." Emma nodded, satisfied with the answer. For her, that was enough. Michael sat down at the table and watched his daughter eat breakfast. She talked as she ate, about a science project at school, about a classmate who made her laugh, about how her stuffed rabbit had almost been left behind at Mrs. Carter's place the day before. Small, scattered stories, but carrying something huge. Peace. He listened to every word. Not because he was afraid of missing anything, but because he knew these moments were the reason behind every decision he had made. Outside the window, the morning sunlight filtered in, soft but warm. A new day was beginning, just like any other. No breaking news on television, no urgent phone calls, no knocks at the door. Everything was still quiet. But somewhere, inside email inboxes, within reporting systems, in offices that had not yet opened, the chain reaction had already begun. Michael didn't know that, and right now he wasn't trying to think about it. He sat there, took the first sip of coffee of the day, looked at his daughter and felt something rare. Peace of mind. Whatever happened next, losing his job, being called in for questioning, or nothing at all, he knew he hadn't turned away. And sometimes, that is enough to keep moving forward. Rachel Whitmore began her morning at 6:40 a.m. It was a routine she had maintained for years, from the early days of building the company with just a handful of employees and a temporarily rented office, to the point where Whitmore Plaza had become a symbol of glass and steel in the heart of the city. She believed in discipline. She believed in systems. She thought that if things were well designed, they would operate exactly as intended. That morning, everything unfolded as usual. She sat down at her desk, the large glass windows behind her overlooking a city slowly coming to life. Her assistant had already arranged the reports, financials, project progress, and meeting schedules. Rachel skimmed through each folder at her familiar pace, marking, approving, forwarding. At 7:22 a.m., a new email appeared in her inbox. The subject line was brief, technical, and unremarkable. Level 2 Safety Incident Report, Whitmore Plaza. Rachel opened the email almost reflexively. At first, she assumed it was merely procedural, an automatically generated system report like dozens she had seen before. But after just the first few lines, her reading slowed, then stopped altogether. She reread it from the beginning, this time more carefully. Images appeared on the screen, clear, direct, with no dramatic angles. A pressure gauge needle is sitting below standard levels. Short video clips showing system readouts, maintenance log entries with signatures repeating in a suspiciously consistent pattern. Rachel felt a faint chill spread from her chest down to her stomach. Not fear. Recognition. She scrolled to the end of the report. The sender's name appeared. Michael Turner, Overnight Security, Contract. Rachel didn't recognize the name. She opened the personnel file. A page so brief it was almost empty. Contract worker, night shift, no photo, no achievements, no promotion history. Just a small line under dependents. Emma Turner, daughter, 8 years old. Rachel leaned back in her chair. She had spent her entire career building complex structures, processes, standards, reports, layers upon layers of oversight. She believed that when everything was checked often enough, risk would be eliminated. But this report hadn't come from a system. It had come from a human being. Rachel picked up the phone and called the head of facilities management. He answered immediately, his voice already tense, as if he had anticipated this call. "We need to talk," Rachel said.
her tone so calm it made it impossible to predict what would follow. She didn't argue. She didn't ask indirect questions. She read out the numbers from the report, pointed out the discrepancies, pointed out how long the issue had persisted. On the other end of the line, the silence stretched longer than usual. "Either your team failed to do their job," Rachel said slowly, "or they did it and deliberately ignored the results. Either way, I need the complete records within 24 hours." She ended the call before he could respond. Rachel stood up and walked toward the glass windows. The city below continued to operate as usual. Cars, pedestrians, coffee shops, beginning to fill. None of them knew that just a few hours earlier, a system assumed to be safe had been on the brink of failure. She thought about the person who had discovered it. A night shift worker. Someone without authority. A name she had never seen mentioned in any meeting. Rachel suddenly realized a deeply unsettling truth. If this man hadn't stopped, if he hadn't looked just a little closer, if he had chosen silence, she would never have known. Her system had not corrected itself. It needed a human being willing to stand up and say, "Something is wrong." Rachel took a deep breath. She had always been proud of her ability to see opportunities where others didn't. But that morning, she was forced to confront a far greater blind spot. She had failed to see the people at the very bottom of the system she herself had built. She returned to her desk and stared at the name on the screen. Michael Turner. An ordinary name. An impossible-to-ignore report. And for the first time in many years, Rachel Whitmore knew that this morning would not pass like any other. Not because of a business decision, but because of a moral choice made when no one was watching. The car stopped in front of the old three-story building at 7:46 a.m. Rachel Whitmore remained seated for a few seconds before opening the door. The building ahead was unremarkable. Faded brick, water stains streaking parts of the wall, a front door slightly off its hinges. No security, no reception lobby, no nameplate. Just a place to live, in the simplest sense of the word. She looked up at the stacked windows, wondering which one belonged to the man who had written the report that had upended her entire morning. Not with dramatic language, but with numbers so straightforward they could not be denied. Rachel stepped inside. The hallway was narrow, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly. The lingering smell of breakfast hung in the air, toast, coffee, a trace of cooking oil. She climbed the stairs, her heels tapping softly against the worn concrete steps. Each step carried her farther from the familiar world of glass and steel and deeper into a space where authority had no place. Apartment 312 was at the end of the hallway. Rachel stopped at the door and adjusted her breathing. She had faced boardrooms, investors, and the media, but now something made her hesitate, perhaps because this was not a meeting, not a negotiation, but an encounter with no script. She knocked. Small footsteps sounded from inside. The door opened to reveal a little girl of about 8, her hair neatly tied back, still wearing pajamas with a faint smear of jam at the corner of her mouth. The child's eyes met Rachel's without fear, only curiosity, in the purely childlike way. "Hello," the girl said. "Are you looking for my dad?" Rachel froze for a split second. She had prepared so many things to say, questions, explanations, but in the face of that gaze, all of it fell away. "Yes," she said softly. "Is your dad home?" "He just got back. He's exhausted." The girl tilted her head, studying Rachel's outfit and shoes. "You're dressed very nicely. Are you a teacher?" Rachel smiled and shook her head. "No, I work where your dad worked last night." Something changed quickly in the girl's expression. Curiosity gave way to a serious, almost solemn look. She straightened slightly, as if instinctively positioning herself between Rachel and the doorway. My dad didn't do anything wrong, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. My dad always does the right thing, even when it's hard. The words weren't rehearsed. They carried no philosophical weight, yet they landed in that narrow space like a bare, undeniable truth. Before Rachel could respond, a man appeared behind the girl. Tall, lean, his shoulders slightly slumped with exhaustion. His eyes flicked briefly toward Rachel, then settled, calm but alert. Emma, go back inside and finish your breakfast, he said gently. The girl looked at her father, then at Rachel once more, as if making sure she had fulfilled her duty of protection. Then she turned and went inside. The man stepped into the doorway. He didn't block the entrance, but he didn't invite her in either. You're from the building, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Rachel replied. I'm Rachel Whitmore. Michael nodded almost imperceptibly. No surprise, no panic. Just the nod of someone who had already prepared himself for every possibility. If you're here to tell me I broke protocol, he said, his voice tired but steady, you can contact the agency. They'll handle it. I'm not here to fire you. That answer made Michael look at her more closely. For the first time, his gaze held not just caution, but consideration. Then, why are you here? Rachel didn't answer immediately. She looked into the apartment behind him, small, tidy, marked by unmistakably ordinary details. A school backpack beside a chair, a small potted plant near the window, a dining table just big enough for two. I'm here to ask, she said slowly. Why? You did what no one else did. Michael was silent. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but a thoughtful one. When he spoke, there was no pride in his voice, and no resentment. Because there are thousands of people working in that building every day, he said, and if something happens, they won't get a second chance. He paused, then continued more slowly. And because my daughter asked me a straightforward question, I want to be able to look at her and answer it without lowering my head. Rachel felt those words unexpectedly reach her, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. She was used to presentations about corporate ethics, but she had never heard someone speak about doing the right thing with such quiet clarity. They stood there, at a doorway between two worlds. No one said anything more, but both understood. Some moments require no agreement, only recognition. And it was precisely there, in a place where power held no authority, that a fundamental change began to take shape. 3 weeks after that night, Michael Turner sat in a conference room on the upper floors of the very building he had once patrolled alone, in silence. Spread across the table in front of him were safety reports, technical diagrams, and pages filled with dense notes. Gone was the cold fluorescent lighting of the security room. Gone was the old swivel chair that creaked with every movement. Everything looked different now, more orderly, more structured. But Michael knew that the most critical change had nothing to do with the setting. The fire suppression system at Whitmore Plaza had been fully repaired within 72 hours. The maintenance company was terminated. Falsified records were handed over to investigators. A few mid-level managers quietly stepped down. No press releases, no noise. There was no scandal, no sensational headlines. Only a building that was now safer. And thousands of people walked into it every morning unaware that one night, everything had nearly gone another way. Michael did not become a headline hero. He didn't tell the story to anyone beyond the few who needed to know. Each day he did his new job, reading reports, asking questions, going down to places few people noticed. Not because he distrusted everything, but because he had learned something essential. Safety does not come from blind trust, but from sustained attention. Rachel Whitmore changed as well. She began spending more time in areas without glass walls and thick carpets. She spoke with maintenance staff, with night shift security, with people who had previously existed only as names on payroll sheets. She read night logs. She asked more questions and accepted the discomfort when answers weren't neat. She didn't call it an awakening. She called it remembering why she had started. But if anyone truly felt the change, it was Emma. The new apartment she shared with her father had an elevator that worked reliably. Emma had her own room, painted a soft purple she had chosen herself. The window looked out over a small park where, in the afternoons, other children ran and laughed. Emma liked the new room. But what she loved most wasn't the paint color or the new desk. It was that her dad could come home earlier, that he could sit and listen as she talked about her day at school, that he could be there for the science presentation she had worked on for 2 whole weeks. That day, standing on the small classroom platform, Emma introduced Michael very simply. "This is my dad. My dad found something that was broken in a very tall building." The teacher smiled, not fully understanding the meaning behind the words, but Michael did. And what he felt wasn't pride, but reassurance. One evening, as father and daughter sat on their new sofa, Emma turned to him and asked, "Dad, that lady who dressed nicely the other day, is she your boss?" "Yes," Michael replied. "Her name is Rachel." Emma thought for a moment, then asked, "Is she a good boss?" Michael was quiet for a few seconds, not because the question was difficult, but because it deserved a careful answer. "She's learning how to be a good boss," he said, "just like I'm learning how to be a good dad." Emma nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Like when I forgot to water the plant because I was busy with homework," she said, "and the plant almost died." Michael smiled softly. "That's right. That's why you have to remember to look at the small things." They sat there in the fading afternoon light, saying nothing more. There was no need. Some lessons don't require explanation. They are passed on through the way we live. Somewhere, in the glass tower reaching into the sky, Rachel Whitmore was still working late. But this time, when she looked at reports, she didn't see only numbers. She searched for signs of silence. She asked herself, is something being overlooked? And somewhere between those two worlds, the world of power and the world of ordinary people, something fragile but real had taken shape. Not a title, not money, but the belief that doing the right thing, even in the dark, still matters. Michael Turner had once accepted a job no one wanted. He stepped into a building filled with problems that were not officially his responsibility. He saw something wrong and did not turn away. Not because anyone was watching, not because he expected a reward, but because there was an 8-year-old girl who would look at him and believe what he said. And sometimes, that is enough. Some stories don't need loud climaxes. They only need a moment when a person chooses not to look away. If this story made you pause for a moment to think, share it with someone who may be facing a difficult choice. Like if you believe quiet values still have a place. Comment if you've ever done the right thing when no one was watching. And subscribe to Deep Life Tales, where everyday stories remind us who we are. See you in the following story.